I wanted to speak first a little bit about what moths and butterflies can do for us. So first, butterflies and moths are fairly diverse in the state of Minnesota. We have 146 butterfly species that are confirmed. That can change year to year depending on the strength of southern migrants, but almost everything there is a resident species and don't really move much in the state of Minnesota. So they're local and they're part of our native fauna. And then, as is true for most moths, we know very little about how many there actually are, but it's easily 10 to 15 times as many as the butterfly diversity. So greatly unknown, but also extraordinarily diverse. Butterflies and moths are actually more passive pollinators in a lot of ways. They're there largely to take a hold of the nectar resources that the plants are providing. And so they're attracted there largely not necessarily for the pollen transfer that the bees are doing. And so small butterflies like these may not be able to actively transport pollen for some species that are being presented up here when the nectar resources are down at the bottom of the plant. Other species of plants have specialized pollen packets that need to be transferred, and it takes a large insect like a bumblebee or very large butterfly to be able to transfer them. So in some ways, butterflies are more accidental in a lot of pollination. But that is not to say that butterflies and moths are not very important representatives in the pollinator community. They do tend to be some of the largest and the most abundant of pollinating insects on the landscape. And so just by their mass effect, they can have a pretty substantial effect. And this is especially true on certain types of plants that are also specialized for pollinating by butterflies. So this long tube on this flower here, this prairie phlox, is specifically designed for a long-tongued insect that can reach all the way down here at the bottom. So there are definitely associations of some types of pollinating insects that are the only pollinators possible for some plants. And one of the great examples of that is the western prairie finch orchid in Minnesota. And that is an endangered species in the state. It's threatened in the United States, and it can be only pollinated by hawk moths. And so there's only actually 2 known species of pollinators for this very rare and beautiful plant in the state. They're both moths. So butterflies and moths can certainly have a huge effect. I want to back up first and compliment the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources on establishing much of what we know about butterflies and moths in the state of Minnesota. The DNR is undergoing a review process, updating its species of greatest conservation need. And currently there are 31 moths and butterflies on that list and just 5 bees, largely because we know nothing about the status of bees in the state of Minnesota in a lot of ways. Those that do end up on these conservation lists tend to be there because of habitat loss, but also because of lack of data. We just don't know much about them. And so it can be a little disproportionate. So we need more survey work. In Minnesota, there's one currently listed state, or one butterfly that's listed at the federal level, the Carter blue butterfly. The intensive surveys in the last few years indicate this may be extinct in the state. It may have recently gone extinct in just the last few years. It's endemic to the oak savannas of western Minnesota. Hasn't been seen in several years now, apparently. And then 2 were recently proposed for addition to the federal species list. The Powesheik skipperling is endangered, and the Dakota skipper is threatened. Those were just proposed this last fall. And I'll be talking more about them in a second. They are both part of the larger prairie butterfly community. As many of you know, prairie is an extraordinarily complex and rich and important ecosystem, but it's also extraordinarily endangered. It's been called the most endangered ecosystem in North America. There's only 1% of it left in Minnesota, and really across the entire range. They formerly stretched from Oklahoma to Saskatchewan. Very little that is remaining, and so instead of these vast oceans of grasses and diverse plant communities stretched on for thousands of miles and these continuous patches, we really now just have to think about them as their own little islands and now experiencing their own problems. And for native pollinating insects in the prairies, that's a real problem because a lot of them just don't have the dispersal ability to get from one piece to the next. So it's very much a local issue, but it's also a statewide issue. And so, and maybe not surprisingly then, there are 15 species of butterflies and moths that are currently on the state endangered, threatened, and special concern list. And 10 of those 15, so 2/3 of the butterflies that are deemed to be in trouble in the state are associated with prairies. The remainders are largely species of the far north that are running into temperature problems, much the same as moose are. So, a lot of these species share a lot of the same habitat in the prairies of western and southern Minnesota. One of them is the beautiful phlox flower moth, a beautiful hot pink and purple moth that just looks exactly like that flower. That it is its exclusive caterpillar host, and it is also one of the only pollinators for this plant. The regal frittler, arguably the most beautiful and most majestic butterfly of the upper Midwest, formerly ranged from Colorado to Nova Scotia, is now essentially extinct east of the Mississippi River, and really is isolated into those tiny little pockets. And so, while it is a good disperser relative to the other species, it's still facing much of the same problems of isolation. And so, Minnesota has okay populations, not the best, not the worst. In much of the range, though, it's considered imperiled or vulnerable or endangered, etc., at various state levels. And the Dakota skipper formerly ranged across much of the upper Midwest, especially in these tall grass prairies of Minnesota and the Dakotas, has now disappeared from at least half of its range. Virtually all those triangles, at least half of those are gone, if not more. And we know, so we think it's gone extinct in Iowa and Illinois, where some of the oldest records are. And in Minnesota, we only know of one viable population near Moorhead. There may have been a sighting in northwest Minnesota this year, but we just don't know. We can't confirm it yet. So it's considered in real trouble across much of the state, and it was just proposed for federal threatened status listing. So the best populations in the world are in the Dakotas. The power-sheet skipperling, I think, is the most Minnesotan butterfly. The monarch is the state butterfly, but this one is really ours. It had probably 95% of the world's records were in the state of Minnesota. Half of the sort range, at least. But in terms of abundance, it was really concentrated in Minnesota. So we're going to call this butterfly, it had a greater concentration in the state of Minnesota than any other butterfly in the world. But we think it's potentially extinct in the state of Minnesota. It's also likely gone extinct in the Dakotas, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois. And really all we're left with that we can be sure about are these little tiny populations on the periphery of the range in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Manitoba. Now, how many are there? Well, we did a lot of really intensive surveys this year. And just 20, 30 years ago, this was one of the most abundant butterflies in the prairies in Minnesota. And it really crossed much of that upper Midwest range. But it's just disappeared in the last 15 years, and there were likely far under 500 individuals existing in the world last year. And all of those really concentrating in these isolated ranges. So, and also, those remaining sites in Michigan and Wisconsin and Manitoba, they're so far dispersed from each other, they are never going to come in contact with each other. So we're really talking about a population, maybe 50 here, 20 there, teetering on the edge of global extinction. So the power-sheet skipperling then would be 3 to 4 times more rare in the wild than giant pandas. So this is one of the most endangered animals on Earth, but almost nobody's heard about it. And it was right here, and it used to be really common. So 2 years ago, the Minnesota Zoo launched the Prairie Butterfly Conservation Program in recognition of the collapse of many of these prairie butterflies and moths. And the real goal then is to utilize the role of the zoo as a breeding organization for endangered species and the outreach that we can then do by then trying to create insurance populations as just an extreme measure to try and save these species from extinction. So creating an insurance population in consultation with a huge number of partners and doing a lot of careful consultation and deliberation on taking good, careful steps. So trying then to just create a backup that in the event that further populations declines in the wild, we can try and have something left. We're doing and facilitating field surveys because we just need always more data. I'm going to be doing some genetic work We know nothing about the degree of differentiation between populations or similarities within populations. And then also be launching some threats research, including pesticides work, in this next few years. And then also utilizing the role as the state's largest environmental education center, with over 1 million visitors a year, and producing and talking about the role of pollinators in the environment. So this has created a huge number of partnerships that we're really quite proud of. It's really an international partnership now, working with Manitoba and all over the place. And we've so far been funded by the Legacy Act, which we're just recommended for funding under LCCMR for 3 more years. So, but I don't want to make this a story about just these rare butterflies, because that's not the primary driver, and that's not what we're really wanting to convey. What we really want to think about is the role of, and the indication of, the collapse of butterflies, like the power shakes you're building as an indication of what's going on in the environment. So the collapse of the prairies and the diverse landscapes and the rich plant communities that they're associated with. So I would also want to give a shout out to the Minnesota DNR again for creating these vast plant databases, because butterflies really are completely dependent on the plants, and the plants are really dependent on that too. So the butterflies and moths, they serve as pollinators. They also are really strong energy converters. They are one of the few organisms that really are actively converting plant mass into animal mass, and then making that available into resources for other animals too. Butterflies are important food sources for a lot of other organisms. But I think the major thing that they can do for us is serve as indicators, because they have a very complex life cycle. With each of these arrows are then hormonally and environmentally controlled, and they're very easily broken. And so we can use them to study many different factors that are going on. So the butterflies are indicating by their shifts in their range and their shifts in their timing that they're moving north, and they're coming out earlier, they're moving up in elevation, and they're responding to changes in their environment, and especially changes in climate. But I think maybe one of the most amazing recent studies that came out about the role of butterflies and moths as pollinators, as indicators, was after the Fukushima nuclear disaster a few years ago. Just 1 year after the disaster, in a butterfly that has 2 generations a year, this species that was quite common started showing up with all these crazy mutations, like deformed eyes, strange spotting patterns that had never been seen before, extra appendages that were reminiscent of the frog deformations in Minnesota years ago, and all sorts of things that had never been seen before. And these were at levels of radiation that were deemed to be safe for humans and largely undetectable, but they were clearly responding to it. So we can use butterflies then as indicators of what's going on. In many ways, they're prairie canaries. They can tell us a lot about some of the roles and causes and changes that are happening in the environment. So that's, I think, the ultimate message, and that's largely why we're getting involved. We want to be able to be, to help with that, and I think this is the kind of forum that's really great for that. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.